Welcome to the Wealth Planning for the Modern Physician podcast, hosted by David Mandell, an attorney, author, and OJM Group partner. We share real-world financial lessons from physicians and insights from experts to impact your bottom line. Check the show notes to get a free copy of our newest book, Wealth Strategies for Today's Physician. Now, over to David.
Hello, it's Dave Mandell, host of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in, either audio, which I think most of you still listen, but for those of you who want to see my face and the two gorgeous guests I have today, we are on YouTube, and so you can watch us. Let me tell you about Michael Byrd and Brad Adatto, who are repeat guests, and I'll give you their brief bios. We'll link to their full bios in the show notes. So start with Brad, alphabetically, with Adatto, starts with an A. He went to Texas Christian for his BA, went to Loyola School of Law for his law degree. He's the son of a medical doctor and a grandson of a medical doctor and dentist, and he has been working in the healthcare industry his entire career. He enjoys guiding clients on the do's and don'ts of this heavily regulated industry and creating compliant arrangements. He's worked with physicians, physician groups, medical service providers, on med spas, ambulatory surgery centers, wellness clinics, and other medical joint ventures. He regularly counsels clients with respect to federal and state healthcare regulations that impact the transactions. Michael Byrd, undergrad, UT Austin, law school at Texas Tech, also a son of a doctor and an entrepreneur. So he has a connection to business and medicine. He has a background as a litigator and a transactional attorney, and brings a kind of a comprehensive perspective to business healthcare issues. He's been named to Texas Rising Stars, Texas Super Lawyers for multiple years, best lawyer in Dallas. These folks have a national practice, but they're based in Dallas. And they have their own podcast called Legal 123s, which we'll link to in the show notes. And I have been a guest on that, and we'll be recording another episode. So if you want to follow me over there, we'll put the link in the show notes so you can check out their podcast. And with that, Brad, Michael, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. We're glad to be back.
Yeah, glad to be here, and I forgive you for listening, Brad, first.
Yeah.
I thought he was going with the best first, not even just alphabetical.
Yeah. Well, next time I'll just do a random flip of a coin. So for the audience, before we get into the questions, guys, I want to just let them know, because I try to do this pretty often. Like you guys, we're now, pretty well into this podcast, season 5. If you want to, when I had Brad and Michael on, we actually did it separately in season 1. So go back to season 1 if you find this stuff interesting, and you can see one episode with Brad, one episode with Michael. Also, Jeff Siegel, who was on last season in 4 and in season 1, is a partner of theirs, who's a neurosurgeon and an attorney. Really interesting conversations with him. But, what I like best about these guys is not only they're very good lawyers and they know the law and how to guide clients and keep them out of harm's way, but they're also very entrepreneurial, even the way they run their law practice. Maybe we'll get to it today, maybe we won't, but they just do things and they think a little bit differently than most lawyers. I like to think I'm the same way, as don't spend much of my time on the law practice and more time building OJM Group, and they've got, podcasts. We've written together. We've written books or chapters of books together. So, we use this topic in our books, and you've heard me say this, doctorpreneur, but I kind of think of them as lawyerpreneurs. So I don't know what you guys think about that, but we'll use that term. And today what we're going to do is kind of a legal grab bag. I emailed with them and just said, hey, give me some topics that are on a lot of physicians' mind, or they're coming up. And some of these, as we'll talk about it, I'll relate back to other episodes, because we did cover some of it, not the legal end of it, but the other pieces. So I think this is a good perspective. And the first one we're going to talk about are these weight loss drugs. We had a plastic surgeon on last season who was talking about how he added this to his practice and sort of pros and cons and things he was giving advice to fellow physicians. Let's talk about some of the legal issues around I'm not even going to try to pronounce the medical word, semaglutide, I think is it. But some of these weight loss drugs, Brad, Michael, whoever wants to go first, I won't pick because you guys will give me a hard time which one I pick.
You want me to do the context? And I guess I'm the appointed person to pronounce the word.
Yes, you can do the peptide talk.
Yeah.
Give the context. That's a good idea.
Semaglutide and tirzepatide. Yeah.
Nice job.
Oh, I'm done. Oh,
Sometimes Wegovia gets in there too.
Yeah. Those are the brand names. But yeah, so the context of, what's going on with the weight loss drugs. So, there is Ozempic, Wegovy. There's a couple of other kind of brand names that are out there that people will see and hear about. And they were on the shortage list for the FDA a few years ago, and so that we can talk a little bit more about that, allowed for compounded versions of these to be used, which is a fraction of the cost. And kind of in combination of that and the studies that kept coming out about the benefits and even new benefits they were finding, and of course the results that people were experiencing that were going on these weight loss drugs, has caused an explosion in this medication. And so what about was a year and a half ago, I can't even remember, it all of a sudden our phone started ringing, and people, I guess it's been about 2 years now.
Yeah.
Our clients were saying, well, what do you know about Ozempic? What do you know about semaglutide? They would have a different term, and they're wanting to graft them into their practice because they would hear of, the opportunity, either the economic opportunity, or they were just so excited by the results that, it completely changed kind of, it was the hot topic as far as what I'm going to add this to my practice and what's the impact. And then all of a sudden it became a dominant revenue stream that almost, was a dependence on the practice. And then, just a little bit of a foreshadow this year, there's been a lot of back and forth about whether or not these are going to come off the shortage list and thus not be allowed to be compounded. And so is that enough context?
Yeah, and the only other context I'd give is this all started off. This was an anti-diabetic drug that one of the side effects was people were losing weight.
Right.
And so what happened was it just got out in the influencer world, like, oh, well, I'm going to take this anti-diabetic drug and I'm going to it's a way of forcing me to lose. Well, it's going to make my body change the way I process food, how my hunger craves. And then these same drug companies started building it so that it was FDA approved as a weight loss drug. So all this happened, and to your point, like at the end of December of 2023 is when it really first started popping up on our radar. Because
22.
Was it 22?
2 years ago?
Yeah. So it also started popping up on our radar where we're hearing all these questions on it. And I know you've already had a doc on it, so we won't go into the mechanics of it because first off, we couldn't. Mm-hmm. But secondly, I think when we hear a doctor wants to enter in that realm, this is where we put our legal hat on and go, okay, first off, remember, this is the practice of medicine, even though it's a weight loss drug. So you kind of have to follow the same protocols, and I won't bore your audience with all those kind of processes on the medical side. But where we start looking at is, all right, how do you bring on that patient? Where are the drugs coming from? Some compounding side. How are you administrating and dispensing of those drugs? And then are you getting all the proper consents that you need to do everything? So I know I just kind of dropped a little bit of a breadcrumb. So there's some things I wanted to cover, but let's go back to the beginning of time. So when that patient does come into that practice for the very first time, you need to intake them like all the other patients. So something called a good faith exam has to occur by that physician or nurse practitioner or the PA, making sure, is that patient a good candidate for those services? Some groups, we find that we're skipping these steps thinking like, oh, it's just, I'm just going to have my RN prescribe it, or they filled out a questionnaire and we said, no. You still have to do the same thing with all types of drugs that come through that door. The next piece, which is not really affecting most of our clinical practices, because most of our clients are on the physician side or the entrepreneurs working with them, is where are they getting the drugs from? And this is the big compounding question, because they're not buying it directly from the large box stores, because they're a shortage anyway. They're getting it from a compounding company. And because of the shortage list that Michael referenced earlier, the FDA says, oh, you, the compounding company, you can basically build that exact same drug, but they're building it for fractions of the dollar. And so what the company, forgive me, was charging $2,000 for, they might be charging $500 for a shot. And so it's a huge market shift. The big issue that our clients weren't realizing is because it was compounding, they can't say on their website, we're using Wegovy or we're using this semaglutide drug. You have to say you're using a weight loss drug or a peptide drug. You have to be very general. And unfortunately, some clients were actually putting the images of those corporate companies on their websites, and their marketing material had that. And so that's the first one we ran into, was them not realizing because you're using compounding, you have to market it differently. And David, you're well aware of all the marketing rules that come around this as it relates to the medical board and the FTC, that you can't do something that's false, deceptive, or misleading. And I don't want to know if you want to add anything to that, Michael.
Yeah, thinking of a physician listening to this, when you're thinking about adding this to your practice, it's still a medical, it's a prescription, and so you have to treat it just like you would any, process that you would to prescribe something to someone. And then you have the kind of pharmacy world coming in potentially to your practice, depending on how you do it. So some practices will say, okay, our program is you come in and we'll evaluate you and then prescribe, and you go fill that at a pharmacy, just like we do all the time at a compounding pharmacy. And then, that pharmacy transaction is between the patient and the pharmacy, and the patient self-injects and then comes in for regular checkups. And from a compliance perspective, that is a cleaner approach. We have clients who want to do those injections out of their office, and so that is where it gets really complicated, because now you have some question of, okay, well, is this practice dispensing the medication, which is kind of acting like a pharmacy, and every state has different rules on that. Some states like Texas, you can't do that as a medical practice, but you have to deal with that from a compliance perspective. And then, if you're injecting it in the office, how's that happening? And how are you holding the medication?
And to Michael's point, and I want to be clear for the audience, what he means is there's an administrative side of it, and there's a dispensing side of it. So the administrative side is what most medical practices are familiar with. Patient comes in, they say, okay, you're approved for this weight loss drug. We're going to inject it ourselves. Well, that administration aspect of it is allowed, because in almost all medical practices, you can inject drugs there. The question starts becoming then, are you then selling all those drugs to that patient? And that's where in a lot of states that switches from administrative side to dispensing side. And in most states, you need a dispensing license at that point. And so that's where it gets kind of complicated. And unfortunately, every single state is different. Some states, like I know Florida, it's really easy to get a dispensing license. Other states, it's much more complicated to get a dispensing license. So, so if you're a Florida practice and you want to also dispense the stuff, you need to go get a dispensing license. Yeah. So that's where a lot of our docs don't realize that they're crossing the line, because they're just putting their doctor hat on, they're administrating and selling the drug, and not really realizing now they fall into the pharmacy rules and regulations when that happens.
And I'd say the hot topic right now is whether or not compounding is going to be allowed. And so there, was a big movement around August of 24 where one of these drugs, I believe it was tirzepatide, was the status was changed on the FDA website. And so there was a bunch of confusion. What does that even mean? And it was determined that, the manufacturer believed that they had resolved their shortage list, but the FDA had not yet agreed with that.
Got it.
Well, then fast forward to October, and the FDA agreed, and that happened by the actual removal of the drug from the shortage list, which caused chaos and not surprisingly a lawsuit to be filed because the outside world's like, there's no way this is off the shortage list. There's still a shortage, whether it's on the list or not, and patients are going to be impacted. And so we're kind of in this weird area right now where everything is allowed the way it was.
Yeah.
But it's uncertain as to how much longer.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to add for your physicians that are listening, if you are using this, what I said earlier, that when you're onboarding a patient, if you're 99% of you are compounding it, you need to have great patient consents that they understand. Number one, this is an off-label use, meaning that it's not FDA approved. Anytime you're using a compounded drug, it's not approved. And two, that they understand that they're also using a compounded drug. I've actually had medical board investigations where a patient reported a doctor. Luckily for him, he had great lawyers who actually made sure he had updated consent, and the medical board dismissed it because he had disclosed it was off-label and he had disclosed that he was using a compounded drug. So that's, again, a very important element as you add this weight loss, no matter what happens with the FDA and down the road, that these are the kind of things, these steps you start going through from understanding what you're getting yourself into. And I think the last one, real quick, was just making sure if you're not used to this kind of drug, that you have proper insurance coverage.
Got it. So a lot of great stuff there, and that's why I let you guys, kind of go. Two summaries, I think, as we move on, because this is a grab bag and we're going to go on to other subjects. One is, hopefully everybody watching or listening to this gets that there are legal issues around this. There's potential liability. Yes. Okay. Back to the lawyerpreneur, doctorpreneur. This is something that, can help patients, can build revenues, can be profitable. So we're not saying just ignore it and be scared and run away, but do it properly. If you have been doing this in your practice and you haven't gotten with your attorney to make sure what you're doing, then, call these guys or get with your attorney to say, just to make sure you're doing the things that they've mentioned so far and stuff they haven't gotten to mention, because we have to move on to the next topic, because there's always rules and exceptions to the exceptions. And that's, what law school is all about. So, that's the legal point of it. The business part of it is, you bring this into your practice. You guys have kind of insinuated this, haven't come out and say it, is that it becomes a revenue source. And now there's some business risk that the fundamental regulation behind it, meaning allowing you to go compound rather than get it from Pfizer or that Danish company, I can't think of the name of it, is potentially, it could be changed by regulation. You were mentioning that this, we thought it was, but no, the rule's still the same. But what you don't want to do from a business point of view is be reliant on something that might get taken away or changed without understanding that risk is there. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Doesn't mean you couldn't even staff around it, but you have to realize that it's not going to be forever, likely, and that you're a bit of the mercy of the regulators to say this has changed and that could affect you. So it doesn't mean, again, walk away from it. Doesn't mean don't take advantage of it. Just means that you have to understand that there's some exposure to change there. So keep that in mind, and then let's move on to the next topic. So next topic is one that we've hit quite often, and I think you guys are almost dedicating this season of your podcast to, which is this and we've had multiple episodes. I can't even name them all. For those of you watching or listening, go back through this season, through the last couple of seasons, and every number of episodes, you'll see something on mergers and acquisitions, something on exiting your practice. We've had docs talk about exiting their practice a couple of years later, looking back, private equity owned. We've had folks talk about going through it. We've had, investment bankers on, some of the same people that Brad and Michael know. Lots of different perspectives. Private equity principal on, talking about the investor perspective. So I think what we wanted to talk about today is not repeating that, but actually taking a step back. And I think you guys have been advising clients in certain ways like this, that there's another side of it, which is not to exit. Meaning to go look at the possibility, or if it's actually come to you, your small practice or even a larger practice, and investors or some kind of a representative has reached out to you, hey, we might be interested in buying your practice. And maybe you've gone down that road, maybe you haven't. Maybe you've considered it, started to put your financials together. But you guys wanted to talk about the idea of not selling and what the other alternatives out there, and make sure that we covered that so people hear that. Tell me just broadly, where you guys are with that concept and just the marketplace as you see it today.
So I think the starting point is that for most of our careers, the way doctors would have an exit strategy was either to recruit a young physician to come be employed and buy them out, or they would, they would sell to another doctor, kind of a local broker, doctor to doctor type deal. We call them internally, we call them Main Street deals. So it was just a small business transaction, and
Main Street as opposed to Wall Street,
right, yeah,
which is all the outside investors. I get it. Yeah.
And so that's been our bread and butter in the physician world for many years. And then you would have different specialties that would have this outside, interest in private equity, and there would be spikes or sometimes even more, like the dental world and dermatology had more than a spike. It was serious momentum. And so we were doing Wall Street deals for those exits. And again, without getting into what's been covered a bunch, what we've been noticing really in 24 is that private equity, call it election year, call it the interest rates, call it whatever, has shied away, particularly from smaller physician practices, single owner physicians, particularly if it's surgical. So all the revenue is really dependent on the hands of that doctor or that doctor or two. And so we're seeing a shift in the momentum, particularly for that profile, back to the traditional way of, okay, well, I'm going to go and have a strategy to recruit physicians to employ them and then buy me out. Or we've had several where it's, kind of recruit and have a shorter term sale, but there's a little bit of a mentorship over a year, maybe 2 years, where there's a transition. But that's been something we've noticed this year. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with that. This has been an interesting year because I think what happened, especially because we're when private equity came out of COVID, they were sitting on, as they say, a lot of dry powder, and they were just buying up anything that moved that they could close on as fast as possible, try to kind of dominate the market in different specialties. And what we saw was even the solo docs who were by themselves or had maybe a PA with them or a nurse practitioner, they were all being bought up. And to Michael's point, most of the time that our entire career is either senior doctor sells to group down the block, or senior doctor sells to younger doctor who is, under the sensei plan, which is he or she are growing that young doctor, and eventually they're going to take over their practice. The shift that happened this year is, I'll say that some of our doctors, just because private equity's been so aggressive the last 2 years, have, they're like, I had a conversation over Thanksgiving. Private equity is the devil. Like, it's horrible. It's ruining medicine. Okay. I'm like, I'm Switzerland. I don't have an opinion on that either way, but a lot of docs all of a sudden have that opinion. So there's a lot of deals this year I've worked on where docs want to kind of get their house in order to then bring on other physicians. And they flat out said, I'm never going to sell the private equity. I want doctors to control medicine. And these are in states where there's no core practice of medicine, even where there's like, no, this has to be doctor driven, and I will build something that other doctors can take over because of my business background, whatever, but I don't want to go to private equity. So that's been all of a sudden a little bit of a shift to that. And again, that doesn't mean there aren't private equity deals happening still. It hasn't been as aggressive as I saw right after COVID and last year also.
Well, yeah, I think one of the reasons for that, and it's not talked about as much, you guys referenced it very, in Michael, in your overview on the state of the market, is interest rates. Because everything regarding private equity is leverage.
Yeah.
So it's a lot easier to make a deal that makes sense when you're borrowing money at 2-3% than at 8-9%. Right. So, you have to be, I think, from the investor and the private equity and the private equity's investors to make them money, they have to be probably a little more judicious in their deals, not just buy up everything and use, no private equity firm wants to have all their cash sitting around because you can't really bill on that. There's not a good, or if you do, you're not certainly getting the 20% of any gains, right? So part of that is sort of market driven. It's probably for the good in general, meaning not every deal is a good one. And there are probably pockets of medicine that should not be involved. But again, we've had on this podcast success stories. We've had warning stories. We've had people who've gone down 3 LOIs, on deals, and then the physician then said, I just don't feel comfortable. So we've heard it from different perspectives. Interesting to hear your perspective, especially where things are today. So if for the smaller practices and maybe, surgical, is the preparation in terms of getting their financial house in order, their EBITDA or whatever, is that similar? Meaning, are they doing the same things or thinking about the same things to get their practice as valuable as it can be, even though it's a Main Street sale versus a Wall Street sale?
I'd say absolutely. I mean, I think there's so much good business discipline to learn from trying to run your business to be, quote, deal ready, as we say, and you'll hear the investment bankers say, and because it's you're having kind of financial discipline in the story you're telling through your financials, and that's going to help you in the Main Street deal. I mean, the challenge in the Main Street deal, which by the way isn't new, is that the buyers oftentimes don't have money, and
right.
So you have to get outside funding sources. And on the one hand, it's easier to get capital than it was, and on the other hand, valuations are being validated and going up because of the PE deals, and so there's still challenges on that side as well. But that's where things are moving.
Yeah, and I had a doc recently say, well, I heard from my friend who sold a private equity, he got 8x for his company, so I want to use that when I'm pricing it for this young doc to buy it. I'm like, well, that's never going to work. You're not going to be able to get 8x from a young doc. You might be get 3 or 2 or 4 maybe even, but it's not going to be the same caliber that you'll get from private equity. And if you're all right with that, then you're fine. But again, it's different. There's lots of pros and cons to sell or not.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me, right? I mean, there's going to have to be some lender to help these young docs buy, but they're not going to be able to afford the same as the institutional, So it's a trade-off, and people have to think hard about what's really important to them. But yeah, obviously Wall Street deals versus Main Street deals. Want to shift now to another topic. We haven't talked about it on this podcast yet, but as a lawyer and entrepreneur myself, I kept an eye on it. And frankly, I don't know what the state of this is. There was, under the Biden administration, some activity, and I can't remember, is the FTC or what, to going after non-competes in general, right? Because the idea was that non-competes in general hurt workers because they inhibit one from leaving a job and going to another job. It inhibits the marketplace a bit, and it's good for employers, but it's not so good for employees and workers. That affects medicine significantly because every doc essentially has a non-compete. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but I would guess that almost every physician contract has a non-compete, other than if you own your own practice, right? They have to be limited. In some states, the rules are different, and you guys are experts on this. So where are we with non-competes in the medical practice / hospital or big group employment? What's the state of the...
Yeah. So to your point is, earlier this year, the FTC did come out with a ruling basically prohibiting non-competes across the board. They had certain limitations. I won't bore your audience with those limitations, but the point being is that they said, non-competes have to go away, and it was supposed to happen basically this summer. The day they released their final rule, there are multiple, obviously, court jurisdictions jumped in, and one here in the state of Texas where a federal judge eventually did agree that the FTC had overstated their ability to come up with this rule, that it was not really within its basic right now. The judge came in and said, they don't have the power to do this. It's not within their charter, basically. It's ambiguous and all these other things, and basically said that their new rule is unenforceable by law. Now, that's up in appeals right now, but as of right now, everything that happened prior to this ruling is really state-driven. Every state has their own version of non-competes. And so depending on how your state views it is really where you're back at. So what you had said, in states that do allow non-competes, you generally will see that. In states that don't, like California, non-competes are unenforceable by law. So you can't even have a non-compete. This trend that we're seeing, and it's about to happen again in next year with a whole bunch of states, is many states are trying to add new they're allowing non-competes, but they're being more restrictive than they've ever been before, and especially with medical providers. It used to be just physicians, but in many states like Pennsylvania and Louisiana, they're about to pass these rules that apply to other medical providers, not just your doctors, but they're limiting it, saying, okay, if you're going to have a non-compete, it only can be for 12 months. Or if you're going to have a non-compete, you have to do A, B, C, E, F, and G. So we're adding a lot of things, and again, for the medical provider ones. So it's an interesting trend. So even though the FTC rule is not applicable right now, and which most people think it's not going to carry forward, the states still have the authority on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is when Biden first kind of announced this intention to have a national ban on non-competes, most attorneys and employment specialists were like, there's no way this is ever going to carry because this is a state law.
Yeah.
And
it's a state right.
Right. Yeah. And so that's what ultimately played out. What's interesting to, and Brad kind of alluded to, is the wake of this is that states really, it kind of pushed some momentum on states to further restrict non-competes. And to Brad's point, particularly in healthcare. And so there is new laws that are coming out pretty often, and they have different flavors to them. Massachusetts has a garden leave rule now that has a little bit of popularity, and it's the idea is that if you're going to make them sit on the sidelines and not be able to compete, so they're tending their garden, then you got to pay them during that time.
I see.
So you got to keep paying their salary, and there's a bunch of detail to that. But the point is that though the FTC rule is not in effect, and I agree with Brad, likely won't come to be in effect, it's really caused a lot of movement across the country. And so it becomes important, if you're a practice looking to have a non-compete, to take a look at what you have. And then if you're a physician employee, you really want to understand kind of the state of that state's non-compete laws to know your risk before you sign off on it.
Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of times where Michael and I get pulled into it, which is actually a phone call I have today, is that someone said, oh, don't worry about non-competes are unenforceable by law. but they're in California. So their entire life, they grew up around non-competes unenforceable. And then if someone goes to Texas and they sign a non-compete, where non-competes, if they meet certain requirements, are enforceable.
Right.
So you have to understand every single state is different on this particular issue.
Yeah, so I think that the takeaway, thank you for that summary, really helpful. For those of you watching or listening, if you're a doc thinking about changing jobs, you got to understand what your current contract says and what the current law is, and maybe even what might be coming down in the near term in your state. As you're saying, there's some stuff that might be passed in the first quarter, maybe of 25, and if you're thinking about moving in 25, you want to understand what those rules are. And the same token, if you're running a practice and trying to make sure that some of your folks are locked up to the extent you can legally, you need to understand, maybe review that contract with your attorneys to make sure it's compliant. So thank you for that. Last topic, which is, everything we've talked about, not surprisingly, is something you've talked about with me before, is you have a 50-cent problem if you deal with it early. You have a $50 problem if you deal with it late, right? I mean, that's the nature of law. I mean, that's why people should get advice. And, I think it was Ben Franklin who said, ounce of prevention, pound of cure. I'm not sure, somebody, but it was almost 300 years ago, right? So good long-term advice. So if someone's looking for a healthcare attorney, for something new that they haven't engaged before, what are the things that you would tell them to look for in a firm or an attorney that could help?
So I would start with this, that we have to acknowledge that in healthcare, if you're a medical practice, that you're in one of the most heavily regulated industries. And so most people have some level of awareness that there's a lot of laws that govern how they can operate a business. But I think there's a misperception about what that means from a compliance perspective. They think of it as a checklist that is, I need to do A, B, and C, and I'm good to go, and I can move on with life. And compliance doesn't work like that. Compliance is a constant moving target because the laws change. As your business changes, that affects compliance. Enforcement changes. You have things like a federal law that comes out of nowhere trying to ban non-competes, but you have stuff like that happening frequently. And so the kind of the ounce of prevention point that you went to is, in a medical practice, it really can cause problems if your mindset is, I'm going to diagnose my own legal problem and say, I need to go and get these A, B, and C boxes checked and do it. And then, once I diagnose my next problem, I'll reach out, and you're going to, it's very likely you're going to get yourself in trouble running your business, also trying to be your own, kind of attorney diagnoser of when you have things that need to be talked about or thought about. And so the most important thing I would say is you want to have a relationship with your attorney, your healthcare attorney, that is an ongoing long-term focus, so that you're staying in front of things on an ongoing basis rather than, bumping from crisis to solution to the next crisis.
Yeah. And to Michael's point, just like physicians, there are a lot of different specialties out there when it comes to lawyers. And so your buddy who you play golf with, that's a real estate attorney, may be the nicest guy ever. And next time you want to buy a dirt deal, great, bring them along. But make sure that you're bringing someone along that not only understands the corporate structure, but understands how to fold those healthcare laws on top of it. Because you can form an entity and not realize that by forming that entity, you have violated some type of regulation. And your buddy, who's the real estate guy or the business attorney, might not understand that either. And so we always talk about a couple different things: form and substance. That the form must match the substance that you're doing. And if they don't, you're outside of compliance. Or, to Michael's point, maybe you did have a healthcare attorney when you first started, and they set it up perfectly, but then you haven't talked to them in 2 or 3 years. And that's where we call the compliance drift happens, is that you were set up perfect. And then you change one thing that changed another thing. And your office manager came in, changed a third thing, and then changed a fifth thing. And you didn't realize all of that is pulling you away from the compliant model that you're in. And so that relationship is critical to make sure that, we call it a practice assessment or whatever you want to do, is that you reflect on what has changed and am I still compliant?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to make 2 comments and we can wrap up. One is, another area of a service area that is, pretty heavily regulated, not as much as medicine, is finance, which is OJM Group. We have a compliance law firm. We have a chief compliance officer who's actually outsourced to a law firm. We have lots, basically everything I do, including this recording before it goes out, will go by that compliance law firm as well as the transcript. So we can't operate without it. It's like, the lights and then compliance, Now we'll complain about it, especially my partners, but it has to be done. Right. That's the cost of doing business and doing it in a way, because we get audited by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we can be in state regulatory bodies, state insurance company regulators, et cetera. So we want to keep our licenses and keep our business, and so we have to do it right. And docs should think of it the same way, right? And that's comment number 1. Comment number 2 is kind of what I started with, a good place to sort of wrap, which is, I had said early on that Michael Brad, very entrepreneurial. And, for those of you watching or listening who say, I don't really have a great healthcare law firm relationship, or it has been the drift that Brad talked about, we did something, but we haven't done much in the past. They allow physicians to work with them on like a subscription annual monthly basis. And they have different service categories, pay more for different services, et cetera, so that you avoid what I think the main reason physicians get out of compliance, and you could react to this as we wrap, but people don't want to call a lawyer because it costs money. All right. So it's like, I probably can just do it on my own and whatever, because as soon as I pick up the phone, every 6 minutes, every 10 minutes, I'm getting a bill. And so rather than using the good resource, they are hesitant to do so because of the business model on the lawyer side, which is every time I talk to you, I'm billing, versus what you guys have created. And this is really impressed me, which is we're going to charge a fee because we do this enough. We have a good idea of what practices need. We're going to charge an ongoing subscription fee so that when you have an issue, you can call up and not worry about that costing you from dime one. You're already paying for it in some ways. And so you're open to having that dialogue so we can keep the problems to be 50-cent problems rather than $50 problems. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in 2017, we started Access Plus, is what we call the program, based on, 25 years of data of what a successful practice spends on legal fees. And the whole concept is we're going to identify what the appropriate amount of investment in staying compliant should be and spread it out. And so we're taking something that can be, even an active client can be variable, right? Like they have a bunch of stuff that they need to get done this month, and then it's smooth sailing for a couple of months, and then it's a blip, and then or a big activity. And so we have really, when we first started offering it, we thought this seems like something that would be more transparent and they would take that fear of, getting that nickel and dime bill away. And we really hit a nerve with it. And to the point where, that's how we work with our clients now. And we even have evolved to the point we'll talk to them and we'll figure out what they need and give them a customized, here's your plan. And so it's been a game changer going back to the lawyerpreneur thing for us, because it just takes away all the friction that can happen with an attorney-client relationship about, surprise bills.
Yeah, I get it. So since we started with Brad, we're going to end with you, Michael. That's it.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Very grateful.
We're at the time, so I want to really thank you guys so much. It was excellent. Good range of topics. I learned a bunch, so I know our audience did. And we'll put, again, for those of you listening, watching, we're going to put, their bios in the show notes. We'll put a link to their podcast in there, to their website. You can learn about their Access Plus, all that kind of great stuff. And again, if you find this valuable, give us a 5-star review, leave us a review, tell your colleagues about us. And in another 2 weeks, we'll have another episode. Thanks for tuning in.
The Wealth Planning for the Modern Physician podcast is brought to you by OJM Group, a multidisciplinary wealth management firm dedicated to helping physicians build and preserve their wealth while reducing taxes. Episodes from previous seasons are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other popular platforms. Podcast listeners can get a free copy of our newest book, Wealth Strategies for Today's Physician. Simply text WPPOD to 844-418-1212 to request your free copy. Be sure to join David every 2 weeks for the newest episode of the Wealth Planning for the Modern Physician podcast. This podcast is being provided for informational purposes only. The ideas and opinions expressed on this show by Mr. Mandell and his guests do not constitute legal, tax, or investment advice or a recommendation of any particular security or strategy, and do not represent the opinions of the underwriters of this programming. Any information prepared from third-party sources is believed to be reliable, though its accuracy is not guaranteed. Opinions expressed in this commentary reflect subjective judgments of the speakers based on conditions at the time of recording and are subject to change without notice. Listeners should seek the input of their own financial, tax, and legal professionals before acting on any of the information provided.